Welcome, my name's Andrew Killick, and I will be giving the session on the corporate finance part of the agenda today. We're going to be covering an update on the funding and transaction market and looking at the issues that actually arise in transactions or when people receive an approach and how to be best prepared for them. In overview at the moment, the market's perhaps surprisingly buoyant. There's a lot of activity going on, although that's not to say that's consistent across the geography or even transaction sizes or sectors. There's significant variation there. The one theme that is common, though, is that whilst deal volumes in the Southwest were at the second highest level ever last year, I say they're apparently declining because those recorded transactions are quite a lot lower, even though there's a lot of work going on in transactions at the moment. Why is that? Well, a lot of that activity and interest is driven by private equity, either directly or them having made previous investments, core investments, looking for bolt-on transactions. However, the one common theme right across the patch is that deals are generally taking far longer to complete. So that probably reflects the fact that we are seeing a lot of activity, even though deal volumes across the market seem to be reducing a little. So if we look at it from a UK point of view, you'll see across the last couple of years a variation from month to month. The last year or so has been just a little bit lower, and the first quarter of this year declining a bit. From a southern point of view, though, that's quite a more dramatic fall off over the first quarter of this year. And as I say, I think that might be partly because of the timing it takes to record the transactions actually completing, but also it's taking longer for them actually to complete in the first place. So if we move on from that to really see what can be done about that and why some of those factors are coming into play. The first one really is in terms of the data, and the challenge for many teams is what they may use for their monthly management accounts pack isn't really the level or detail or appropriate for transactions or even for advanced fundraising. So as a result of that, there's a bit of a mismatch between what external parties will be seeking and what internally is generated on a normal basis. I think the other main theme is that it's taking far longer in terms of the overall process because of factors post heads of terms. So many transactions, once heads of terms have been reached, the deal should progress smoothly from there on in a way that everybody knowing how it's actually going to end up. But recently there's been more focus on the movement from the original offer for the business to what it actually means for shares and the value there, the equity value compared to the enterprise value. There's more due diligence, more structuring refinements as a result of the due diligence and additional legal input, all of which can take far longer for the transaction to actually complete. So when we actually look at the data aspects, what are we really saying? Actually, if you don't have the detail yourself and you're actually trying to portray a positive position going forwards, you'll have to make some significant assumptions about the future and the growth. That may limit how it looks in terms of value optimization if you're a bit cautious on that. But on the other hand, if you take that too far, unless there's support for it, or even it can be demonstrated to be incorrect, it'll undermine the credibility potentially for the whole projection scenario. And these items may only come out in due diligence, hence why deal structures may then be refined. I think it's also to recognise that they need to be fully integrated. So if the P&L, balance sheet and cash flow are not fully integrated, they're more likely to result in further work or issues arising from that for a buyer or funder to actually take matters further forwards. I think one way of looking at it is looking back at your own data, and there's a list of questions here to consider. Is it providing you with the answers to these areas? So for example, will it help you in terms of look for continuous improvement and saving costs? Or actually will it just report on the history and you move on in terms of we'll see what will happen next month? So a number of factors there are worth considering to see, does your data actually enable you to make those conclusions and recommendations from it, or actually would you be after more information? That starts you looking at it from a buyer or funder's perspective rather than from a monthly management accounts or year-end process, and hopefully enables you to see what may be required. This slide, although there's quite a lot on it, hopefully demonstrates on the left the data inputs from a variety of different sources, but actually the cleansing process that will go on in the middle as external parties will look to take that data on from whatever source you're using to then actually from their point of view share it, consider it, evaluate it going further forwards. So this process will use a variety of sources, and it's actually demonstrating there's quite a lot to it, rather than merely commenting on what you send across to them when you've received an information request list. And what we were saying earlier on about the heads of terms and what we're seeing there is that due diligence historically, I think, would be financial, tax and legal, whereas now we're seeing it very common to have far more coverage, in particular in terms of cyber and ESG, as well as broader IT and commercial aspects. The challenge is as funders and buyers get more up to speed with their own processes and how things change, some of these may actually come through relatively late in the process and therefore may be quite a surprise. So I think it's well worth to be prepared for them to happen, even if they're not actually on the list of actions at the outset. When you stand back and look at all of this and the areas that people will be looking at the business, it's not surprising people will often say at the end of it, well, I wish we'd perhaps known some of those factors beforehand and been appropriately prepared for it. And that's really where vendor due diligence or vendor assist comes into play. That's where you and your advisors, from a vendor assist point of view, are actually pulling the information together first of all, having a look at it to see that it ties up before any external party is seeing it. The step beyond that, the vendor due diligence, is when your advisors actually undertake that report. You see a draft of that report first of all. There may be things to amend, to improve, so that the final report only reflects that position, and that then goes to buyers. The added benefit of doing that is if you have several interested parties, you can send that information to them all at the same time, rather than actually selecting one preferred purchaser and then leaving them the opportunity to negotiate further. By having vendor due diligence and presenting it to parties, you can receive their post-due diligence offers before selecting the party you actually progress further with. That enables more of the control of the process to remain with you and your advisors, rather than the buyer and their advisors. And as I was alluding to earlier on, the enterprise value may have been set out in the heads of terms, but often people haven't gone into sufficient detail to really look at how it moves from that aspect into the equity value, i.e. the value for the shares. And the items that affect that can be considerable and grey. So where we talk about the end there, what's debt like? Well, for some people, that will be debt. But actually, what about holiday accrual that hasn't actually been taken yet? What about dilapidations on leases? So some buyers will treat those as debt, others won't. Are you aware of the factors and what is normalised working capital, especially in view of the period we've gone through over the last few years? So all of those factors can take into account and reduce the price that you actually get for your shares compared to the headline price. And therefore, having an understanding of what those items could be and how to present them will help you maximise the prices for shareholders rather than actually the headline price in the heads of terms. So what we're really saying is consider the overall equity story from an external perspective and ensure all the factors and information you get supports that. And therefore, the best way of doing that is evaluating that beforehand, before somebody sees that, and making sure the data and all the information provided supports it, rather than ad hoc, the financial due diligence information suggesting particular growth that may actually be undermined by where the business is in certain other areas in terms of contractual, legal, cyber, to actually support that growth coming through. So do ensure that the whole story stacks up rather than presenting it piecemeal for buyers or funders to then challenge it subsequently. And finally, from a funding point of view, my colleagues in a moment will go into far more detail on the debt point of view, but I just wanted to give that overview picture. At the moment, what are we seeing? Well, traditional banks are being far more cautious, perhaps understandably, because at the end of the day, from a debt provider's point of view, if they have a problem with an account and write it off, they lose the money. It takes numerous accounts and customers make up for that. On the other hand, if the business does well, they tend to get their money back plus interest and nothing else, or maybe even earlier. Whereas for others who are taking more risk, they may be able to get more return. Linked to that, I think it's fair to say many of the Main Street banks are focusing on their existing customers and are less interested in new to bank potential new customers. As ever, we're seeing alt-fi, alternative finance and challenger banks continue to grow. However, I think it's fair to say that some have struggled to get their own funding and therefore have been declining, whereas new ones appear quite regularly. In contrast to all above, private equity has a massive amount of cash, looking for homes still, and that is driving significant element and proportion of deals today. Other aspects are affecting is ESG. We've talked about this beforehand, but actually that's becoming more and more visible across all aspects of funding. But I thought as a last point, I'd look at things the other way around, rather than just for borrowing. Recognise a number of you maybe sat on deposit accounts and wondering how do you get best value for those. But it's more to just make you aware that even some providers at the moment on instant access accounts are providing up to 3%. And it's those amounts that actually may quite help, whereas others are actually concerned in terms of the interest rates increasing on borrowing. But it's nice and refreshing to realise that actually it's still coming through for some challenger banks on the interest rates that you can earn as well. So in overview terms, I would say ensure that you're better prepared for transactions and funding than perhaps you've needed to be in the past. More areas will be looked at, and therefore make sure you use that and your advisors to help you maximise the overall value you can get, and also from a non-financial point of view, make the process easier for yourself as well. Thank you. I'll now hand over to my colleagues running through the debt advisory position in more detail.